My name is Alara Vance, and I am 72 years old. I have lived my entire life believing that if you dedicated yourself to your work and raised your children with good values, you were guaranteed a quiet, dignified old age. I was mistaken. Just last week, my son Arthur invited me to an upscale cafe. When he excused himself to answer his phone, the young waiter motioned me closer, his expression filled with genuine fear. He informed me that my son wasn't on a phone call. He told me Arthur's real location and the person he was currently meeting. Not 5 minutes after that, I was maneuvering myself out of a tiny restroom window, every one of my old joints crying out in objection. What I witnessed in that shadowy alley shattered my heart. And then, it instilled in me a chilling, unshakable determination. Before I continue with what transpired, would be so grateful if you'd share in the comments where you are hearing my story. And please, press that like and subscribe button if you agree that a person's dignity is something to be defended, regardless of how old they are. My trip had begun 2 days prior, the moment I first set foot in my son's kitchen. It was the most immaculate room I had ever encountered. And I do not mean that as a compliment. It was utterly sterile. Every surface was either a harsh white or a cold, flat gray. This ranged from the marble counters, which appeared as if they'd never been touched by a single breadcrumb, to the imposing stainless steel refrigerator that loomed silently like a monument. Not one family photograph was displayed on its door, not a single colorful magnet from a family trip. The space felt less like a home and more like a staged display in a high-end magazine, not a place where anyone actually resided or prepared meals that warmed the soul. I perched on a high, rigid stool, feeling as though my comfortable old walking shoes were a blemish on the gleaming floor. My daughter-in-law, Brenda, was meticulously arranging a salad on a dish. It resembled a work of abstract art. A scattering of green leaves, a fan of avocado slices, a dusting of some exotic seeds. She had no intention of eating it. She was photographing it with her smartphone, angling the plate meticulously to capture the lighting just right. "You must capture the authenticity of the moment," she murmured, seemingly to herself, her gaze locked on her screen. People online are desperate for what's real. I found myself wondering what could possibly be real about a $20 salad that was clearly just for show. I glanced down at my own hands, at the wrinkles and spots from 72 years of living, of gardening and raising a family. That was real. Arthur then entered, carrying 2 wine glasses. He placed one before me. "Try this, Mom. It's an Italian white," he announced. "It's not like that sweet boxed wine you tend to drink." I simply nudged the glass away from me. My late husband, Edward, never cared for spirits in our home after witnessing his own father's struggles. Arthur knew that. Perhaps it had slipped his mind. Or perhaps, it just didn't matter to him anymore. "So, Mom, tell Brenda one of your old stories," Arthur said, rushing to fill the awkward silence. "Tell her about how you started the community garden all by yourself, from that overgrown vacant lot." I began to tell the true story, the one about the difficult beginning, about having to beg for leftover seeds from the garden center because we couldn't afford to buy new packets. I told her about the night a sudden frost threatened to kill everything and how Edward and I were out all night with old sheets and blankets, fighting to save those first fragile seedlings. These were my precious memories, the very bedrock of our family. And then my old friend Mabel, she loaned me $100 with nothing but a promise. Arthur interrupted me instantly, producing a strained, shallow laugh. "What Mom means is, she drafted a community proposal and secured initial seed money from a local benefactor who believed in her project." He turned to Brenda and gave a little wink. "My mother can be a bit too modest at times." I said nothing more. He wasn't simply restating what I'd said. He was actively erasing my history. He was polishing away the hardship, the community effort, the generosity of friends, and refashioning my life story into something sterile and presentable for his sophisticated new life. "I'm just relieved you finally sold the house," Arthur went on, abruptly shifting the topic. "It was such a burden. Now you can truly rest and enjoy your retirement." A burden? He called my husband's legacy, the home that contained 40 years of our shared life and laughter, a burden? My chest constricted. I stared at my son, searching for the little boy who used to trail after me in that garden, his knees covered in dirt. But that boy was gone. In his stead sat a stranger, one who communicated in a dialect of finance and public image that was foreign to me. After our meal, once Brenda had ascended the stairs to perform what she termed her evening meditation, Arthur set a thick sheaf of documents on the table before me. The crisp scent of fresh paper and toner wafted into the air. "What is this?" I inquired. "It's just some investment paperwork, Mom," he replied, his voice unnervingly slick. "I've been consulting with my financial planner. They've identified a wonderful portfolio for retirees. Absolutely no risk, just guaranteed returns. It will ensure you're comfortable for the rest of your life, with no worries at all." He produced a very expensive-looking pen and immediately turned the entire stack to the final page, tapping his finger on an empty signature line next to my typed name. "You just need to sign right here. I'll take care of everything else." I gazed at the documents. There must have been 30 pages, at least, all of it covered in minuscule print and legal jargon I couldn't begin to decipher. "Let me read it first," I stated, reaching for the papers. A brief flicker of irritation passed over Arthur's features. His smile disappeared. "Mom, you really don't need to bother. It's highly complicated material. I've already gone through it all. It's perfect for you, I promise." "Son," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I haven't put my signature on anything without reading it first in 72 years. I am not going to begin doing so tonight." A different sort of silence descended upon the room. It was no longer merely uncomfortable. It was oppressive. I could sense his impatience, his aggravation, radiating from him in palpable waves. He was concealing something. An honest person is never in such a rush. He expelled a long, exasperated breath. "Fine," he snapped, getting to his feet. "But don't be too long about it. Excellent opportunities don't last forever." He pivoted and strode from the room, leaving me by myself with the stack of documents and a chilling sense of dread that was just starting to settle deep within me. To dissipate the tension, or so he alleged, Arthur took me to a cafe just down the block. It wasn't a real cafe, not like the diners I remembered where the linoleum was worn and the waitress knew your order by heart. This establishment was dim and modern, with quiet music playing that sounded like a faint pulse. The atmosphere was thick with costly perfume and the smell of coffees that cost more per cup than I used to earn in an entire day. Young, fashionable people filled the space, all in stylish attire, their faces illuminated by the pale light of their smartphones. They weren't laughing heartily. They whispered their discussions, which sounded like hushed secrets about investments and lavish vacations I could scarcely comprehend. I felt like an apparition from a bygone era, a faded sepia photograph in a world of brilliant, sharp color. I observed a young woman, no older than Arthur was when he first went to university, displaying a designer handbag on the table. That handbag likely cost more than the deposit on my first home. The very home where I raised the man who was now fidgeting uncomfortably in the chair next to me. Arthur ordered me a complicated-looking herbal tea with a slice of lemon. He hadn't inquired about what I might like. He simply presumed. He repeatedly checked his phone, his thumb restlessly gliding over the glass. He wasn't present with me. Not in any meaningful way. His thoughts were somewhere else entirely. Following 5 minutes of this tense quiet, his phone vibrated. He glanced at it with an expression of relief so profound it felt like an insult. "Ah, apologies," he said, rising from his chair. "It's the office. A major client in Asia. I must take this. It's critical." He didn't pause for me to reply. He just patted my shoulder, a gesture that felt detached and rushed, and moved quickly toward the exit. "I'll be back in a moment," he called out. But I had a feeling he wouldn't. I was left sitting by myself at the small, polished table, a 72-year-old woman in a simple cardigan, adrift in a world where I was an outsider, left behind by my own son. The expensive tea tasted sharp in my mouth. I remained there for quite some time, watching the steam rise from my cup, the soft beat of the music and the low hum of voices blurring into a monotonous drone. I sensed someone approach and turned to see the waiter. He was a young man, perhaps 25, with sharp, perceptive eyes. He was wiping down an adjacent table with a fresh cloth, but his attention wasn't on his task. His attention was on me. He had been observing me ever since I arrived. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice low and polite. "I hope I'm not intruding. But are you Mrs. Vance? Elara Vance?" I was quite startled. No one in this neighborhood would know my name. I was just Arthur's elderly mother, a remnant from a life he was clearly trying to forget. "I am," I replied, my tone wary. "How do you know who I am?" The young man set his cleaning cloth aside. He leaned in slightly, and the polished, professional smile he offered the other patrons disappeared. In its place was an expression that was authentic and sincere. "My name is Leo," he said. My mother's name is Maria. She was a nurse's aide at the clinic on 8th Street, many years ago. You and your husband, Mr. Edward Vance. You used to visit every week when he was ill." Hearing my husband's name spoken aloud in this cold, alien place was like an unexpected warmth blooming in my chest. Edward. It had been 2 years since I'd lost him, but at times the sorrow still felt as keen as a shard of glass. I recalled Maria, a gentle woman who seemed to work tirelessly. "I remember your mother," I said, my voice softening. "A very kind woman. How is she doing?" Leo smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his eyes. "She's well. She's retired now. She still speaks about your husband all the time." He paused, and his look became more solemn. "I was just a boy, but I recall one winter when I was terribly sick with pneumonia. My mom couldn't pay for the prescription and was frantic about losing her job if she missed work. Your husband learned about it somehow. He showed up at our apartment one evening with a bag of groceries and the medicine from the pharmacy. He told my mom not to worry about her shifts for a week, that he'd quietly arranged it. He just helped. He never requested anything in return. He never mentioned it to a soul." Leo looked down at the table, then back up at me. "My mother never forgot his kindness. I never forgot it. Mr. Vance, he was one of the truly good ones." Listening to him speak about Edward with such deep respect and gratitude, it felt like a sip of cool water on a parched day. It brought back the memory of the world Arthur had abandoned. A world where kindness wasn't a calculated exchange, where neighbors genuinely cared for one another. It was the world Edward and I had spent our lives building together. For the first time since my arrival, I didn't feel like an apparition. I felt like Elara Vance again. I felt like Edward's wife. I was still enveloped in the warmth of that recollection when Leo's entire bearing changed. The amicable light in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by a keen, pressing focus. He cast a quick look over his shoulder, as if wary of being overheard. The relaxed way he had been wiping the table became strained. His motions were suddenly short and purposeful. He placed the cloth down with a quiet sound that seemed to echo in the small pocket of silence around us. Then, he did something that made me jump. He reached across the small table and gripped my forearm. His grip wasn't painful, but it was insistent, commanding my complete attention. "Listen to me, Mrs. Vance," he whispered, his voice so quiet I had to lean forward to catch it above the ambient music. "You must listen very carefully." The only thing I could do was nod, my heart beginning to pulse a little more rapidly. "Your son, Arthur. He is not on a business call," Leo stated, the words tumbling out quickly. "He isn't speaking with any client." The statement lingered in the air, completely bewildering. I began to form a question, but he applied gentle pressure to my arm, silencing me. "He is in the alley." Out the back, Leo pressed on, his eyes flicking toward a door labeled "Employees Only." "He's meeting a man in an expensive suit. A man who looks like he enjoys intimidating people. I've seen them meeting before. This is their 3rd meeting this month." My thoughts were scrambling to make sense of it. An alley. A menacing man in a suit. It was nonsensical, but then Leo delivered the final, devastating piece. They are not discussing investments, Mrs. Vance. I overheard them last week. They were arguing. They're talking about your house, about selling your house. And your son, he sounded frightened. My world seemed to spin. The warmth from Edward's memory vanished, replaced by an icy dread that permeated my very bones. The documents, the intense pressure for me to sign immediately. Arthur's flash of anger when I insisted on reading them. It all coalesced in my mind, creating one, singular, hideous image. My son was not trying to help me. He was trying to steal from me. The soft murmur of the cafe dissolved until the only sound I could perceive was the desperate hammering of my own heart. I met Leo's gaze, and he recognized the dawning comprehension on my face. He gave my forearm one final, firm squeeze before releasing it, retrieving his cloth, and walking away as if no exchange had occurred. But everything had occurred. Everything was different. My thoughts were in chaos, but my body understood precisely what needed to be done. I could not return to the table. Arthur would read the truth in my expression, see the betrayal that felt like a raw, open wound that I rose, leaving the untouched tea on the table, and moved toward the restrooms with a determined pace. I did not falter. I did not hesitate. I did not glance behind me. Inside, the restroom was compact and, mercifully, unoccupied. It held one stall, one washbasin, and a small, frosted glass window set high on the rear wall. It was the type of window intended for air circulation, not for a person to climb through. But on this night, it was my only escape route. My heart thudded against my ribs, yet my mind was unnaturally serene. The older woman who had entered this cafe was no longer present. A different woman was in her place. A woman driven by a cold, searing rage. I hauled the heavy waste receptacle beneath the window. It had a foul odor, but I was indifferent. I climbed atop it, my knees aching in fierce protest. The window latch was rigid with grime and old paint. For one heart-stopping moment, I feared I lacked the strength to open it. I threw my entire weight against it, my knuckles grazing the rough frame. It finally yielded with a jarring shriek. The chill of the night air struck my face. I hoisted myself up, my arm muscles trembling with the effort. Every twinge from my joints was an objection. But the righteous fire inside me was more powerful than the discomfort. For an instant, I was caught, half inside and half out, an absurd spectacle. Then I shoved myself forward and fell out, landing heavily on the moist pavement of the alley. I lay there for a moment, the impact jarring my bones, before quickly struggling back to my feet. I had to know the truth. I had to witness it for myself. The following morning, I was awake before anyone, but I remained in bed. When Arthur tapped on my door, I let a long moment pass before I responded. And when I finally did, I pitched my voice to sound frail and thin. "I'm not feeling very well, dear," I said, managing a weak cough. "I believe I'll just stay in bed today. My old bones are insisting I take it easy." I heard him hesitate on the other side of the door. I could practically hear the calculations happening in his mind. Then his voice returned, coated in a false concern that was as transparent as glass. "Oh, of course, Mom. You just rest. Brenda and I will bring some breakfast up to you." I had no desire for their breakfast. I had no desire for their feigned concern. What I desperately needed was for them to vacate the house so I could process everything. An hour later, Brenda entered carrying a tray. On it sat a small portion of oatmeal and a small glass of juice. "We're just so worried about you, Alara," she said, her voice overflowing with synthetic sweetness. "It's so crucial to listen to your body at your age." At my age. The phrase was intended to sound considerate, but I now understood its true meaning. It was a dismissal. It was their way of implying I was delicate, untrustworthy, and perhaps even slipping mentally. I performed my role. I managed a few tiny spoonfuls of the oatmeal and assured her it was lovely, despite it having the consistency of paste. Arthur appeared in the doorway, already attired in a suit that must have cost a small fortune. "You just relax today, Mom," he said. "Don't you worry about anything at all, especially not those complex papers. I told you I would manage all of it. He smiled, but his gaze was sharp, appraising. He was observing me, assessing my state. Every word he uttered now carried a hidden meaning. Relax meant don't become suspicious. Don't worry meant don't examine this too closely. And I'll manage everything was a thinly veiled threat. I just gave a slow nod, lowering my gaze to the bowl. Thank you, dear, I whispered. I'm so fortunate to have you taking care of me. The falsehood tasted like ash in my mouth, but I forced it down. It was necessary. It was the only method I had to discover the true depth of this deception. As soon as I heard the front door latch, my performance ended. I was no longer a frail old woman. I was a predator, and my quarry had just departed. My hands trembled slightly, but my mind was crystal clear. There was only one person I knew I could turn to. I located my old tablet, the device Arthur had gifted me 2 Christmases ago, claiming it would help me stay connected. I had hardly ever turned it on, but I knew how to initiate a video call. I found his number in my contacts and tapped the screen. It rang twice before he answered. His voice was exactly as I recalled, powerful, precise, and intolerant of any foolishness. Marcus Thorne speaking. Marcus, I said, my own voice coming out hoarse. It's Alara. Alara Vance. A short silence followed, and then his tone warmed immediately. Alara. My goodness, it's been far too long. How are you holding up, dear lady? We had not spoken since Edward's funeral. Marcus and my husband had been friends for decades, back from their days as young men volunteering for civic projects in our community. Marcus had gone on to become a lawyer, a formidable one, but he never lost touch with his roots. I'm managing, Marcus. But I require your assistance, I said, wasting no time. It's concerning Arthur. The warmth in his voice instantly evaporated, replaced by a sharp, professional focus. What has he done? I drew a deep breath. He wants me to sign some documents. He's calling them investment papers, claiming they are to secure my retirement. I glanced at the thick pile of documents on the bedside table. It looked like a viper, coiled and ready to strike. But he was in a terrible rush, Marcus. A desperate hurry. And something about it feels profoundly wrong. I didn't mention the cafe, or the alley, or the young waiter Leo. Not yet. I needed facts before I made accusations. Marcus was quiet for a second, processing my words. He knew me. He knew I was not a woman prone to baseless panic. All right, Alara, he said, his voice shifting to all business. You are not to sign a single thing. Do you understand me? Not even your name on a stray piece of paper. Can you get those documents to me? How? I asked. I can't very well stroll out of here and put them in the post. Does that son of yours still have you on that tablet I recommended? He inquired. Yes, I answered. Excellent. The camera on that device is more than adequate. I am going to send you my private email address right now. I need you to take a clear photograph of every single page of that document. Every page, Alara. Ensure the corners are flat and you have good light. Then email the images to me. Are you able to do that? It seemed daunting, but the resolve in his voice bolstered my own. This was a task I could accomplish. A tangible step. I can do that, I affirmed. Good woman, he replied. Send them to me as quickly as you can. I will clear my afternoon. And Alara, be careful. If your intuition is telling you something is amiss, you trust it. Your intuition has been right for 72 years. We disconnected the call, and an instant later, a message bearing his email address materialized on my screen. I retrieved the stack of papers and, with hands that were remarkably steady, I started my task. One after another, I smoothed each page flat against the bedspread, angling the bedside lamp for the best light, and captured an image. The entire time, I felt like a covert agent operating inside my own son's home, and the realization was a bitter one. But I persisted. This was no longer just about me. This was about safeguarding the home Edward and I had created, the legacy we had intended to pass down. Once I had transmitted the final photograph, the quiet of the house seemed to descend on me. It was a new kind of quiet. What had previously been uncomfortable silence was now a silence thick with deceit. Waiting for Marcus to call back was the most difficult part. I couldn't simply remain in that guest bedroom, gazing at the immaculate walls. I needed to move. I padded downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water, my stockinged feet making no sound on the cold, glossy floor. I opened a drawer in search of a plain water glass, not one of the delicate, long-stemmed glasses they favored. It was a utility drawer, the type all homes have, yet theirs was perfectly organized, containing batteries, elastic bands, restaurant menus, and concealed beneath them, a pile of envelopes bound by a thick rubber band. My hand paused for only an instant before I lifted them out. This was not advertising mail. These were from credit card issuers, a luxury car leasing company, and a private equity group I did not recognize. I meticulously slipped the topmost envelope from the stack. The words were emblazoned in a harsh, red font, "Final Notice." My blood ran cold. I extracted another. "Past due." And another. "Immediate payment required." It was a collection of their shame, a quiet testament to a life built on smoke and mirrors. This perfect, sterile house wasn't a real home. It was a movie set. And every single prop was a fake. I placed the letters back precisely where I had found them and slid the drawer shut. My gaze drifted across the living room, but I was seeing it with new eyes. I focused on the large, vibrant painting hanging on the wall. From a distance, it seemed impressive, an expensive abstract. But as I drew nearer, I could see it wasn't a painting at all. It was a cheap print, the kind one buys from a website, stretched across a wooden frame to mimic a real canvas. It had no texture, no soul. I moved to the bookshelf where Brenda displayed one of her costly-looking handbags, positioned like a sculpture. I lifted it. My entire life, I have worked with my hands. I know the feel of quality, the weight and aroma of genuine leather. This was not it. It felt flimsy, like plastic, and artificial. It was a shoddy imitation, a deception created to impress those who wouldn't know the difference. I spotted Arthur's ostentatious watch resting on his desk in the small office alcove. I picked it up. It was light, far too light. It felt hollow, almost like a child's toy. Everything, from the art on their walls to the watch on his wrist, was a meticulously built fantasy. My son wasn't just in some minor difficulty. He was completely submerged. He and his wife were residing in a house of cards, and they were fully prepared to drag my own home, the only truly real thing we had left, down with them. At that moment, my tablet vibrated on the kitchen counter. It was Marcus. My heart hammered against my ribs. The period of waiting was finished. The time for the truth had arrived. I snatched up the tablet on the first buzz. My own face stared back at me from the dark screen, a weary old woman with frightened eyes. I swiped the screen and held it to my ear. "Marcus." "Elara," he said. His voice was cold. All the familiar warmth from our earlier conversation had evaporated. It was replaced by something hard and unyielding, like tempered steel. "I've reviewed every single page, Elara. I've reviewed it twice." I held my breath. I could hear the faint sound of papers shuffling on his end. "Your son is a liar," he stated. There was no gentleness in his voice, only a stark, brutal honesty. "These are not investment documents. There is no portfolio for retirees. There is no special fund to guarantee your future. It is all a lie, Elara. A total and complete fabrication." The floor seemed to vanish from beneath my feet. I had to grip the edge of the granite counter to keep myself upright. What is it, then?" I managed to stammer. "It's a quitclaim deed, Elara," he said, and he enunciated each syllable slowly, deliberately, like a judge delivering a final sentence. "Do you understand what that is?" No, I whispered. It means you are signing away your legal rights to your property. You are quitting your claim. You would be gifting your house, the home you and Edward poured your entire lives into, to Arthur, voluntarily, for the symbolic sum of $1. It's buried deep on page 17, inside a paragraph so dense with legal terminology it's specifically designed to make you give up reading. It's a deception, Elara. A trap. The oldest, most heartless deception in the book. I couldn't find my voice. My throat felt constricted. My lungs ached. My house. Edward's garden. The porch swing where we sat together on warm evenings. The very walls that had absorbed all our joy and all our grief. He was trying to take it all. Once you sign this, Elara, it is over, Marcus's voice sliced through the fog in my mind. It is legally binding. You would be willingly handing him everything. You would be left with no home, no assets, nothing. He could have you evicted onto the street the very next day, and there would be absolutely nothing I could do to prevent it. He is not attempting to secure your future, Elara. He is attempting to steal it to finance his own. I collapsed onto one of the cold, rigid kitchen stools. The beautiful, sterile room seemed to tilt and spin around me. I thought of Arthur as a small boy, sobbing in my arms after he'd fallen from his bicycle. I thought of the immense pride I'd felt at his university graduation. I thought of all the sacrifices Edward and I had made for him, all the unconditional love we had invested in him. And this was his repayment. This was his gratitude. The shock was so immense it bypassed grief, bypassed heartbreak. It settled deep into my bones as a cold, profound stillness. The kind of absolute stillness that precedes a violent storm. Marcus was still speaking, mentioning legal strategies, about steps we could take. But I was no longer truly hearing him. I was staring at my own reflection in the dark screen of the tablet. The fear was gone from the old woman's eyes. It had been replaced by something else entirely. Something hard. Something relentless. The storm was here. When they arrived home that evening, the psychological assault began. It didn't commence with a declaration of war, but with quiet, insidious maneuvers, all calculated to make me question my own sanity. I was sitting in the living room, pretending to read a magazine, when Arthur entered. "Hey, Mom." His tone was light, casual. "I just wanted to let you know I put your keys in that ceramic dish by the front door. That way, you'll always be able to find them. Don't want you misplacing them." I hadn't misplaced them. They had been on the end table directly beside my armchair, where I had deliberately placed them. He had moved them. It was a minor act, a tiny disruption of my environment, but it carried a clear message: I am in control of this house. You are not. The following day, it worsened. At breakfast, I mentioned that I should call my old neighbor George to ask after his wife. Brenda shot Arthur a look of deep, theatrical concern. "Oh, Elara, dear," she said, her voice saturated with pity. "Don't you recall? Arthur told you just yesterday. George's wife, Martha, passed on 6 months ago. We were so terribly worried about how you'd handle the news." I stared at them. I had spoken to George just last week. His wife, Martha, was perfectly fine. She had just taken 3rd place in a local gardening competition. But they both gazed at me with such convincing sympathy, such tender sadness, that for one terrifying, disorienting second, a wave of profound doubt crashed over me. Did I imagine that phone call? Is my mind failing me? I caught the briefest flicker of triumph in Arthur's eyes before he concealed it with a sigh. "It's all right, Mom," he said, patting my hand. "Memory can be tricky. We're here to support you." They were attempting to construct a cage around my mind, and the bars of that cage were forged from my own self-doubt. They began hiding my belongings. My reading glasses would disappear from my bedside table only to be discovered later inside the refrigerator. My wallet would be gone from my purse, only for Brenda to find it in the pantry, next to the tea bags. Each time, they would share worried looks and treat me like an infant who could no longer be trusted with her own things. The most calculated and cruelest attack, however, was delivered via Brenda's smartphone. That evening, I observed her typing frantically, a sad, contrived smile on her face. A few hours later, my tablet pinged with a notification. A friend from my old neighborhood had shared a post from Brenda's public social media page. It included a photograph of me, taken that morning when I wasn't aware. I was seated by the window, and the angle of the light made me look frail and lost. The caption written beneath it was a masterclass in passive-aggressive cruelty. "It's one of the most difficult journeys a family can embark on," she wrote. "Caring for a parent who is slowly fading from view. Some days are more clear than others. We treasure every lucid moment, every memory she can still grasp. It's truly heartbreaking to watch the woman who was always so strong become confused by the simplest tasks. But we are facing this challenge with love and boundless patience. So grateful for my incredible husband for being my rock during this emotional time." She concluded with a string of hashtags: #eldercare, #familyjourney, #dementiaawareness, #lovememom, #stayingstrong. She was actively manufacturing a public narrative. She was informing the world that Alara Vance was losing her faculties. She was fabricating a story that would cause anyone, including a court official, to question my competence. Any attempt I made to defend myself would simply be dismissed as a symptom of the very confusion she was describing. I read the entire post, and a rage so pure and so cold flooded my system that it instantly incinersat any lingering sadness. They weren't just trying to steal my home. They were trying to steal my very identity. They were attempting to erase me, to reduce me to a senile old woman before I was even gone. I powered off the tablet. I looked across the room where they sat watching television, appearing for all the world like the perfect, devoted family. I allowed a slightly baffled, vacant look to settle on my features. If they insisted on me being a forgetful old woman, then that is precisely who I would become. I would play their twisted game. I would be the most convincing confused old woman they had ever encountered. And from the very center of the cage they were building, would find the leverage to tear their entire fabricated world down. I leaned fully into their story. I embraced the character they had assigned me. The next morning, I came downstairs and asked Brenda what day of the week it was. "It's Wednesday, Alara," she replied patiently, as if speaking to a small child. I nodded, poured a cup of coffee, and sat at the table. 5 minutes later, I looked up from my mug and asked Arthur, "Dear, what day is it today?" He and Brenda shared a significant look. It was a look of validation, of a shared triumph. Their hypothesis about my deteriorating mind was being confirmed. "It's Wednesday, Mom," Arthur said, his voice slow and deliberate. "Just like Brenda told you." I looked down at the table, feigning disorientation. "Oh, right. Of course." Inside, I was a tightly coiled spring. Every condescending word, every pitying glance, was adding to the tension. They believed they were locking me in a cage, but what they were really doing was handing me the key. A forgetful old woman is invisible. She is considered harmless. She is someone you can speak openly in front of, assuming she will neither comprehend nor recall. And so, I made myself invisible. I began muttering to myself, just quiet, nonsensical phrases. I would stand in the center of the living room for a full minute, gazing around as if I'd forgotten my purpose for being there. I spent one entire afternoon attempting to use their complex television remote, pressing random buttons, causing the screen to flash strange menus until Arthur approached with a long-suffering sigh and changed the channel to a nature documentary for me. "Here you go, Mom," he'd said. Nice and simple. As I sat there, pretending to be mesmerized by a program on sea turtles, I was, in reality, listening. I listened to their hushed, tense phone calls about interest rates. I listened to Brenda complaining bitterly about the cost of their upcoming ski trip to Aspen. I listened to Arthur on a call with the man from the alley, assuring him, just a few more days. My mother is, well, she's not all there. It's just about finding the right moment. They were getting reckless. Their growing confidence was making them sloppy. They saw a frail old woman in an armchair, but they failed to see the woman inside. They couldn't see the woman who was meticulously assembling the pieces of their desperation, their lies, and their vulnerabilities. I began to shuffle when I walked. I accidentally spilled a little coffee and then stared at the puddle with wide, innocent eyes. I let my mouth hang slightly open while I watched television. I became a ghost in their pristine house, a piece of inconvenient furniture they had to navigate. And all the while, I was observing, listening, and waiting. I was no longer merely the intended victim of their plot. I had become an active participant. I was the fool in their little play, and I was going to make damn sure my performance was believable enough to lead them directly to their own downfall. They believed my mind was a blank slate. They had no idea I was using it to write their final scene. The nights were the most difficult. The house would descend into absolute quiet around midnight, but I would lie in bed, wide awake for hours, my mind racing. On the third night of my performance, I waited until I heard the soft click of their master bedroom door, followed by the low hum of their thermostat. I gave them one more hour, just to be certain. Then, soundlessly, I slipped out of my bed. The tablet was on my nightstand, its screen a dark void. It felt unnatural in my hands, a piece of technology from Arthur's world. But tonight, it was my only resource, my only weapon. I crept into the guest bathroom, closing the door without a whisper, and sat on the cold tile edge of the bathtub. The dim light from the screen was the only illumination. I didn't know the name of the man in the suit from the alley, so I began with what I did know. I typed in Arthur Vance and the name of his financial firm. The first result was the company's official website. It was sleek, glossy, and professional, filled with smiling pictures of Arthur and his partners, glowing testimonials from happy clients, and grand promises of secure growth and financial freedom. It was the public mask, the beautiful, carefully constructed lie. I knew the truth would be buried much deeper. I opened a new search tab. This time, I typed in Arthur's name again, but I appended different words. Words I had overheard. Words I now suspected. Debt. Lawsuit. Investment loss. Complaint. For a long time, nothing came up. Just more articles celebrating his firm, more links to his flawless social media presence. It was like a digital fortress, deflecting all inquiry. But I was patient. I spent 50 years learning to find the hidden flaw in a piece of fabric. I would find the flaw here. I kept scrolling, page after page, digging far past the polished surface of the search results. And then, I found it. It was a link to an obscure online discussion forum for investors. The post was dated 2 years prior. The title was blunt, warning about Vance Financial Group. My heart began to pound. I clicked the link. A user, a man who identified himself as a retired schoolteacher, described how he had lost his entire pension in a high-risk tech fund that Arthur's firm had aggressively recommended. He called Arthur a smooth talker, a predator who targets older, trusting clients. The post concluded with a desperate question: has anyone else been burned by this man? Beneath it were dozens of replies. Story after story. A widow who had lost her husband's life insurance payout. A young couple who had lost the down payment for their first home. It was a digital graveyard of shattered dreams, and all paths led directly back to my son. I searched for the name of the tech fund they all mentioned. More results flooded in. Articles detailing its sudden and catastrophic collapse, rife with accusations of gross mismanagement. This wasn't a minor error in judgment. This was a disaster. In one of the longest discussion threads, a user described what happened after the fund imploded. He wrote about the aggressive lending companies that immediately started calling, offering rescue loans to the desperate investors who had lost everything. He mentioned one firm in particular, a company with an intimidating name, Apex Holdings. I typed Apex Holdings into the search bar. The results were starkly different. This website wasn't glossy. It was minimalist, cold, and imposing. There were no smiling faces. And on the Our Team page, I saw him. It was the man from the alley. His photograph was right there, a cold, professional headshot. He had the dead eyes of a shark. His name was Silas Thorne. Now I had him. I opened one final search tab. I typed in Arthur Vance and Silas Thorne. And at that, the fortress walls crumbled. I found public records. Liens filed against all of Arthur's assets. High-interest loan agreements with absolutely staggering penalty clauses. I saw the numbers, the long strings of zeros that represented the financial black hole my son had dug for himself. It was a debt so vast, so crushing, it made me physically nauseous. I finally understood everything. The fake watch, the imitation handbag, the desperate, frantic need to maintain appearances. They weren't just living beyond their means. They were being hunted. Silas Thorne was the hunter, and my son was his captive. And the price for my son's freedom, the collateral demanded for his mountain of lies, was my home. My home. Edward's home. The only real, tangible thing we had left in this world. The final piece of the puzzle clicked sickeningly into place. I turned off the tablet, and the small bathroom was plunged into total darkness. I sat there on the edge of the tub for a long, long time, alone in the dark with the truth. The shock was gone. The sadness had burned away. All that remained was a cold, sharp, and terrible clarity. I knew exactly what I was up against. And I knew, with absolute certainty, what I had to do. I sat there in the pitch-black bathroom, the chill of the porcelain seeping into my old bones, but I didn't feel it. I was seeing the entire situation with a dreadful new lucidity, a complete picture pieced together from hushed words in a cafe, legal documents on a screen, and the cheap feel of a fake leather handbag. This wasn't a simple tale of a greedy son trying to swindle his elderly mother. It was far uglier. It was a story of abject fear. I saw Arthur, my bright, ambitious son, flying too close to the sun. I saw him making promises he couldn't possibly keep, gambling with other people's life savings, with the futures of widows and retired teachers. I saw the precise moment it all came crashing down, the collapse of that tech fund, the ensuing wave of panic. And then, I saw the shark that had been circling in the water, Silas Thorne, that he didn't just offer loans, he offered a lifeline that was, in reality, a noose. My son, terrified of exposure and drowning in shame, grabbed it. He made a deal with the devil to conceal his failure. The luxury car, the sterile White House, Brenda's imaginary online life, it was all a desperate stage play. It was a performance to convince the world, and perhaps even themselves, that they were still succeeding, even as the water rose rapidly around their necks. They weren't criminal masterminds. They were terrified, weak people trapped in a high-end prison of their own construction. And my house, my real, solid, paid-for house, was the ransom. It was the price to prevent the shark from tearing them to pieces. This new understanding didn't make me forgive him. No, the betrayal was too personal, too calculated for that. But it did change the nature of my anger. I was no longer fighting just against my son's greed. I was fighting against his weakness, his cowardice, the moral decay that had taken root when he chose to sacrifice his own mother to save himself from the consequences of his choices. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are the most dangerous. He was no less of a threat, but he was also a tragedy. My son wasn't a monster. He was just a weak man who had made a monster's choice. And I, his mother, was the one who would have to confront it. The first hint of dawn was painting the small window gray when I called Marcus again. I hadn't slept. Sleep was a luxury I could no longer afford. He answered on the first ring, his voice sharp and alert, as if he had been awaiting my call. Elara? What is it? I know why he's doing it, Marcus, I said, my voice a low whisper. It's worse than we thought. It's not just greed. It's fear. I spent the next 10 minutes laying the entire sordid story out for him. The collapsed fund, the ruined investors, Apex Holdings, Silas Thorne, the crushing mountain of debt. I told him about the fake watch and the stack of final notice letters hidden in the kitchen drawer. I painted a grim picture of the desperate, hollow life my son had built. He listened without a single interruption, a quality that made him a formidable lawyer and an even better friend. When I finally finished, the only sound on the line was his quiet, measured breathing. "So," he said at last, his voice hard. "He's not just a liar. He's a trapped animal. That's more dangerous. Much more dangerous." "What are our options, Marcus?" I asked. "Legally? We have him, Alara," he explained. "What he's doing is textbook elder financial abuse. With that quitclaim deed as primary evidence, and the context of his massive debt as motive, we could build a criminal case for fraud. He could go to prison. A long time. Prison." The word struck me like a physical blow. Despite the white-hot rage, despite the profound betrayal, the thought of my only son, Arthur, behind bars, it was a pain I couldn't process. He had shattered my trust, but he was still my blood. He was still Edward's boy. "No," I said, the word escaping me before I had even fully formed the thought. "No prison. I will not do that to him. There must be another way. A way to stop him, to save my home, without completely destroying what is left of him." There was another long silence on the line. I could almost hear Marcus weighing the legal chess moves. "If we don't use the threat of criminal charges, Alara, our leverage is severely limited," he said gently. "He holds all the emotional cards. He's your son." His words felt like a dead end. And for a bleak moment, I felt a wave of true despair. But then, a memory surfaced, pushing through the fog of my anger and exhaustion. It was a memory of Edward, in his final weeks, sitting with me on our porch. He was frail, but his eyes were as clear and sharp as ever. He had taken my hand. "Alara," he'd said, his voice a soft rasp. "If Arthur ever gets into real trouble, the kind of trouble his pride won't let him admit, there's something you need to know. Under our old bed, the one we bought right after we were married, there's an old tin box. It's full of my mother's old recipes. But there's something else tucked in there, too. My fail-safe." At the time, I had sadly dismissed it as the wandering talk of a dying man. A fail-safe. But now. "Marcus," I said, my voice suddenly alive with a new, strange energy. "Edward. He told me something before he passed. About a box. A tin box, under our bed." I relayed to him exactly what Edward had said. I had no idea what it meant, but it was a loose thread. And at that moment, it was the only one I had. That afternoon, I put my new plan into action. I shuffled out of my room, playing my part, and found Arthur in his home office, staring intently at his glowing computer screen. I leaned against the door jamb, making sure to appear a bit unsteady on my feet. "Son," I said, my voice soft and wistful. I've been thinking about your father." He turned, his professional mask instantly replaced by one of cautious concern. "What about him, Mom?" "There are just some things," I said, letting my gaze drift off into the distance. "Some of his old things. His photo albums, that silly harmonica I bought him for his 40th birthday. They're still at the house. I feel like I need to see them. To hold them." I let my voice crack, just slightly, on the final word. I watched his face intently. I saw the flicker of calculation in his eyes. He thought this was a sign of sentimental weakness, another symptom of my decline. He saw it as an opportunity. "Of course, Mom," he said, his voice as smooth as oil. "Of course. We can go over tomorrow." "No," I said, a little too quickly. I softened my tone. "No, dear. I feel I need to go now. Please. It feels important." He agreed. I knew he would. In his mind, taking the confused old woman on a trip down memory lane would only make me more sentimental, more pliable, more willing to sign those papers when he presented them again. The drive to my old neighborhood was suffocatingly quiet. Arthur played some soft, atmospheric music, the kind of music designed to be ignored. I stared out the passenger window as the gleaming high-rises and trendy cafes of his world gave way to the familiar brick bungalows and ancient oak trees of mine. It's really changed, hasn't it? Arthur said, breaking the silence. All these old places are being snapped up. Property values are soaring. You were smart to hold on to your place for so long, Mom. I just nodded, not looking at him. He thought he was discussing real estate. I heard the true meaning. You were smart to hold on to it for me. Your father loved this street, I said quietly, still looking out the window. He knew every neighbor, every dog's name. He was a great man, Arthur said. The words sounded hollow, rehearsed. He always wanted what was best for us. Yes, he did, I replied, finally turning to look directly at him. He was always thinking ahead. Always making sure the family was protected. He smiled, completely missing the sharp warning in my voice. He thought I was just reminiscing. He had no idea I was forecasting his future. When Arthur unlocked the front door, the air that met me was the air of my own life. It was a smell of old wood, dust motes dancing in the afternoon light, and the faint, lingering scent of Edward's pipe tobacco from his favorite chair. It was the smell of home. After the cold, sterile, and odorless silence of Arthur's house, this silence was different. It was a peaceful silence, a quiet rich with memory. Every creak of the hardwood floor beneath my feet was a familiar welcome. I saw the faint scratch on the hallway wall where a 7-year-old Arthur had crashed his little red tricycle. I saw the worn spot on the armchair where Edward used to sit and read for hours. This house wasn't just a structure, it was a living, breathing record of our love, our struggles, our entire shared world. Arthur followed me inside, already looking impatient, glancing at his phone. He didn't see what I saw. To him, this was just an asset, a collection of old things. To me, it was sacred. I walked directly to our bedroom. It was exactly as I had left it. The old quilt Edward's grandmother had made was still folded neatly at the foot of the bed. The bed itself, the very first piece of furniture we ever bought as a married couple, looked small and solid. It had held us through sickness and health, through bitter arguments and joyful reconciliations, for nearly 50 years. I did not hesitate. I got down on my hands and knees, ignoring the sharp, fiery protest from my joints. The space under the bed was dark and layered with dust that I reached my arm deep into the gloom, my fingers searching. And then I felt it, the cold, smooth metal of the old tin box. It was a simple thing, painted with faded roses. Annette used to store her grandmother's recipe cards in it. As I carefully pulled it out into the light, my heart was hammering. This box was more than just memories, it was a final message from the past. It was Annette's ultimate move in a complex game she had anticipated we might one day be forced to play. It was her fail-safe. I settled onto the floor of our old bedroom, watching the dust motes dance in the sunbeams around me. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted the rusty latch on the tin box. A familiar scent rose to greet me, the smell of old paper, dried herbs, the faint ghost of cinnamon. It was Annette's scent. On top was exactly what I expected. Hundreds of her grandmother's recipe cards, all written in a beautiful, looping cursive script that had faded over the decades. I ran my thumb over a card for gingerbread, a smudge of ancient flour still visible in the corner. For a brief moment, a wave of profound grief almost overpowered me. This was her. This was the woman I loved. I carefully lifted the stack of recipe cards out and set them aside. And underneath, my breath hitched in my throat. It didn't belong. It was a thick manila folder, crisp and official, a stark contrast to the soft, faded personal history of the recipes. There was no label on the outside. My heart began to beat a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. I opened it. The first page was a dense wall of legal language, most of it blurring together. But then my eyes focused, and certain phrases stood out with blinding clarity. The Annette Vance Heritage Trust. And below that, irrevocable. I flipped the page. My eyes scanned the text, searching, and then I found it, the property located at 14 Elm Street. My house. It was all there in black and white, signed by Annette and a notary public, dated 5 years ago, just after her diagnosis. I read the key paragraph 3 times to be certain my eyes weren't deceiving me. Upon my passing, the property was not to be inherited by our son. It was to be donated in its entirety to a registered community land trust with the express purpose of developing affordable housing for local families. I leaned back against the bed, the papers rattling in my hand, and a slow smile spread across my face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated awe. Annette. My quiet, gentle Annette. She had seen it years ago. She had recognized this potential for moral darkness, this crippling weakness in our son, and she had built an ark to protect us all from the flood she knew might come. This wasn't an act of doubt. It was an act of profound, unbreakable love. My son was trying to sell a property that he could never, ever own. He was trying to steal a ghost. And in my hand, I held my wife's final, brilliant move. I held the checkmate. Chess pawn, the trap is set. When I walked back into Arthur's house, I was carrying a dusty photo album and Annette's little music box. I placed them on the table, props from my performance. Arthur and Brenda looked at me, their expressions a mix of pity and impatience. They believed the trip had softened me, drowning me in a wave of nostalgia that would make me easier to manage. They had no idea I had just finished arming myself for war. I was quiet during dinner. I ate my food slowly, methodically. I even complimented Brenda on her cooking, which was another bland, colorless dish that tasted of nothing. My newfound calmness seemed to unsettle them more than my previous feigned confusion. They kept exchanging wary glances, trying to determine what had shifted. They likely assumed I had finally reached a state of peaceful resignation, that I had accepted my fate as a forgetful old woman who needed to be taken care of. After the plates were cleared, I folded my hands on the table. I've been thinking, I said, my voice even and clear. You're right, son. It's time for me to stop worrying about these things. I'm ready to sign the papers. A wave of overwhelming relief washed over Arthur's face. It was so obvious it was almost pathetic. He shot a triumphant look at Brenda, a silent celebration. The finish line was in sight. That's wonderful, Mom, he said, his voice oozing with false sincerity. I'm so glad you see we're just trying to help. I do, I said, looking him straight in the eye. But I have 2 conditions. The smile on his face tightened just a little. Conditions? I'm an old woman, Arthur, I said with a small, self-deprecating shrug. I do things the old-fashioned way. I want my lawyer to be there when I sign. Just to look everything over. Make sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. A formality, you understand. He relaxed immediately. Of course. A supposedly senile old woman asking for a lawyer was perfectly in character. It was a meaningless gesture, a final, feeble attempt to feel in control. Of course, Mom. Whatever makes you comfortable, he said magnanimously. And the second thing, I continued, this partner of yours, the man who put together this wonderful investment for me, I'd like to meet him. I want to be there to personally thank him for helping our family. I want to shake his hand. Arthur beamed. My request was the ultimate validation of his entire scheme. Not only was his senile mother agreeing to sign, but she was asking to personally thank the man who was helping him to rob her. The arrogance, the sheer, blinding pride, was written all over his face. He saw a closing ceremony, a final victory lap. He didn't see the jaws of the trap closing around him. Absolutely, Mom, he said. I'll arrange a meeting at his office for tomorrow. That's a wonderful idea. He stood up, looking pleased with himself, the perfect picture of the successful son. He had no idea he had just agreed to personally escort his executioner to his own hanging. Thorne paced the room like a caged tiger. This is a disaster, he spat, running a hand through his perfect hair. He wasn't talking to us, he was talking to himself. A federal case. My firm's reputation destroyed. He whirled on Arthur again. You stupid, stupid little man. Did you really think you could get away with this? Did you think I wouldn't find out? I watched it all unfold, a silent observer in the storm I had created. I felt no joy. I felt no triumph. Seeing my son crumble, seeing his life detonate before my eyes, was the most painful thing I had ever witnessed. But as I looked at the wreckage, at the sobbing wife and the ruined predator, I knew this had to happen. This was the only way. The poison had to be drawn out. The lies had to be burned away. This was the terrible, necessary price for the truth. This was the payoff. All eyes were on Arthur and Thorne, but my attention went to Brenda. She was the one who broke the fastest. The sobs that had started as whimpers escalated into a full-blown hysterical breakdown. This was not the quiet, dignified sorrow she posted about online. This was the raw, ugly sound of a world ending. Her meticulously applied makeup began to run, carving black streaks down her pale cheeks. Her perfect white suit, the symbol of her manufactured success, now looked like a costume for a tragedy. "Our trip to Aspen," she wailed, her voice cracking. The words were nonsensical, but they revealed everything. She wasn't crying for her husband's betrayal or my pain. She was crying for the loss of her lifestyle, for the vacations, the handbags, the likes, the followers. She was crying for the death of her brand. My followers. My brand partnerships. Everything. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. It's all gone. It's all ruined. She looked up at Arthur, but there was no love in her eyes, only a furious, burning accusation. "You promised me," she shrieked, her voice shrill. "You promised me everything was fine. You liar." The entire image she had built, the curated fantasy of a perfect life, had been set on fire in this cold, sterile office, and she was screaming from inside the flames. It was a complete and total collapse, not of a person, but of a persona, and it was a pitiful, devastating sight to behold. Amid the chaos, I slowly got to my feet. The cane I had been leaning on now felt like a king's scepter. Every eye in the room turned to me. The anger, the sobbing, the panic, it all went quiet. I didn't look at Thorne. I didn't look at Brenda. I looked only at my son. He was still slumped in the chair, a hollowed-out version of the man he pretended to be. He wouldn't meet my gaze. He just stared at the polished floor as if it held the answers to his ruined life. "Your mother," I began, and my voice was quiet, but it filled the room. "Your mother always saw the best in you, Arthur. Even when you couldn't see it in yourself. She knew you had a good heart, but she also knew your pride. Your fear of failure could lead you down a dark path." I took a step closer, standing over him, not as a victor, but as a father. "She didn't create that trust to punish you. She created it to protect you. She knew this world of easy money and fake success could swallow you whole. She was trying to protect the family's legacy, Arthur. And that legacy isn't a house. It's not a number in a bank account. It's about integrity. It's about knowing the difference between what's real and what's just for show." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my old, worn wallet. I took out a single, crumpled business card and placed it on the desk in front of him. It was the card for the director of the Community Land Trust, the organization that now legally owned our home. "She left you an opportunity, son," I said softly. "A way back. You could go to them. Offer to help. Swing a hammer. Learn what it really means to build something real with your own two hands. Not for money, not for show, but for your own soul. The choice is yours." I didn't need to press charges. I didn't need to see him in jail. The world he had built for himself was already his prison. I had just handed him the key. Whether he chose to use it was up to him. Without another word, I turned and walked toward the door. Marcus followed, her hand resting briefly on my shoulder. I didn't look back at the wreckage I was leaving behind, the crying, the yelling, the shattered illusions. I walked out of that cold glass tower and into the afternoon sun. For the first time in a very long time, I felt at peace. I hadn't destroyed my son. I had protected my wife's legacy. I had defended my dignity. Order had been restored. And that was a victory worth more than any house or any amount of money. This experience taught me one final lesson, a lesson from my wife, Annette. A family's true legacy isn't the property or the money you leave behind, but the integrity and wisdom you protect for the future. My son was drowning in a world of fake success. And in his desperation, he tried to pull me under with him. I learned that sometimes the greatest act of love isn't shielding your children from their mistakes, but forcing them to confront a hard and painful truth. I had to protect our real legacy, one built on dignity, from the illusion of wealth that can destroy a family from the inside out. The office of Silas Thorne was exactly what I had expected. It was on the top floor of a glass skyscraper, looking down on the rest of the city. The room was cold, not just in temperature, but in spirit. There was a huge mahogany desk, a wall of windows, and nothing personal. It was the sterile den of a predator. We arrived first. Arthur strode in like he owned the place, a broad, confident smile on his face. Brenda was beside him, dressed in a sharp white suit, looking like a woman who had just won the lottery. They were buzzing with a nervous, triumphant energy. They thought this was their coronation. I shuffled in behind them, leaning a little on my cane, playing my role to the very last moment. I looked around the intimidating room with wide, slightly confused eyes. Silas Thorne entered a moment later. He was exactly as I remembered from the alley, tall, impeccably dressed, with eyes that didn't just look at you, they assessed you. He shook Arthur's hand with slick, practiced charm. "Arthur, a pleasure," he said, his voice a low, smooth purr. "And this must be the man of the hour." He turned his shark-like smile on me. Arthur laughed. "Mom, this is Mr. Thorne, the man who is helping us secure your future." I just nodded slowly, looking up at him from under my brow. The last to arrive was Marcus. She walked in and the entire atmosphere of the room instantly shifted. She wasn't smiling. She carried a worn leather briefcase and wore a simple dark suit. She radiated a quiet, unshakable authority that made Thorne's expensive office suddenly seem cheap and unnecessary. She nodded curtly at Thorne and Arthur, then came and stood directly beside my chair. The two sides were assembled. On one side of the vast desk sat Arthur and Brenda, overflowing with arrogance and greed. On the other side sat Marcus and me, armed with nothing but the truth. The air was thick with unspoken words, with lies and anticipation. The storm was here. It was time for the lightning to strike. Silas Thorne sat back in his enormous leather chair and steepled his fingers. He looked at Arthur with a smug, proprietary air. "Well then," he began, his voice smooth as oil. "Shall we get to the pleasant business at hand? We have before us a simple quitclaim deed, a formality to transfer Mrs. Vance's primary residence into her son's care for asset management. Arthur, if you could just pass the documents to your mother." Arthur reached eagerly for the papers Thorne was pushing across the desk. But before his fingers could touch them, Marcus placed her hand flat on the folder, stopping it cold. "That won't be necessary," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room's atmosphere like a surgeon's scalpel. Arthur froze, his hand hovering in the air. Brenda's perfect smile faltered. Thorne raised a single, questioning eyebrow. "I'm sorry," he said. Marcus ignored him. She opened her own worn briefcase and pulled out a single, thick folder. It was the manila folder from Annette's tin box. She placed it on the desk with a soft, definitive thud. "We seem to have a misunderstanding about the ownership of the property in question," Marcus said, her eyes fixed entirely on Arthur. "My client, Mrs. Vance, cannot sign a quitclaim deed for the property at 14 Elm Street for a very simple reason. He doesn't own it." The change in Arthur's face was a slow, agonizing spectacle. First, there was confusion, a slight furrowing of his brow. He looked at me as if I was the source of this bizarre joke. Then, as Marcus opened the folder, the confusion curdled into disbelief. His mouth opened slightly. He was about to speak, to dismiss this as senile nonsense, but Marcus began to read. The Annette Vance Heritage Trust, she read, her voice ringing with clarity. An irrevocable trust established 5 years ago. The sole asset of this trust is the property located at 14 Elm Street. Arthur's face went white, not pale, but a bloodless, ghastly white. The confident, successful son vanished, replaced by a terrified boy caught in a terrible lie. He stared at the papers, then at me, his eyes wide with a dawning, sickening horror. Brenda didn't understand the legal terms, but she understood the look on her husband's face. The triumphant sparkle in her eyes died. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice a thin thread of sound. "What is she talking about?" Silas Thorne was no longer smiling. The mask of the charming businessman had completely dropped. His eyes, which had been lazily confident, were now narrowed, cold, and intensely focused on the documents in Marcus's hands. The shark had smelled blood, but it wasn't mine. He looked at Arthur, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine predatory anger. He had been played. Marcus didn't look at Thorne. She didn't look at Brenda. She looked only at Arthur, the boy she had known since he was in diapers. "What this means, Arthur," she said, her voice devoid of any pity, "is that this house has not belonged to your father for the last 5 years. It belongs to a trust. A trust your mother created to protect the family's legacy. Your father cannot give you what he does not have. You are trying to sell a house that was never yours to begin with." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the faint hum of the city traffic 50 floors below. Arthur was frozen, his face a mask of utter devastation. But Marcus was not finished. She let the silence hang in the air for a long, painful moment before she delivered the final, crushing blow. "You see," she said, her voice dropping to a low, icy tone. "What you've done here, Arthur, is more than just a family squabble. It's more than just a lie. When you knowingly create a fraudulent document, a quitclaim deed for a property you have no legal right to, with the intent of using it as collateral to secure a loan." She paused, letting her eyes drift from Arthur's shattered face to Silas Thorne's stony one. "That's called bank fraud. And when the entity you're trying to defraud is a legally established trust, that elevates the crime significantly. We're no longer talking about a civil matter. We're talking about a federal offense." That was the word that broke the spell, federal. It was a word that carried weight, a word that meant serious, life-altering consequences. Brenda made a small, wounded sound, like a dying animal. "No," she whimpered. "No." But it was Silas Thorne who reacted first. The shark had been circling, and now it attacked its own. He shot up from his chair, his calm, collected demeanor utterly gone, replaced by a raw, unrestrained fury. His face was dark with rage. "I have no part in this," he snarled, his voice a low growl. He pointed a trembling finger at Arthur, who flinched as if he had been struck. This little worm came to me. He swore the house was his free and clear. He brought me forged documents, a fake appraisal. He lied to me." Thorne looked at Marcus, his eyes blazing. "I am the victim here. I was deceived." The chaos erupted. Brenda started sobbing, loud, ugly sobs that had none of the performative grace of her online persona. This was real, gut-wrenching despair. "Arthur, tell them it's not true," she cried. "Tell them." But Arthur couldn't speak. He just sat there, slumped in his chair, a completely broken man. The illusion of success, the carefully constructed facade he had spent years building, had been obliterated in less than 5 minutes. He looked small, pathetic. All the fight was gone.